Between the years of 1861 and 1865, the United States endured a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. What began as a political crisis evolved into the deadliest conflict in American history, a devastating war that would claim over 600,000 lives and fundamentally alter the course of a nation. From battlefields drenched in blood to the halls of power, where leaders grappled with impossible choices, the American Civil War tested the very foundation of the American experiment. This is the story of how a young nation nearly tore itself apart, and how through sacrifice, perseverance, and the courage of remarkable individuals, it managed to emerge from the darkness and reimagine itself. But to understand how America found itself on the brink of destruction, we must first look back at the tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades. By the mid-19th century, the United States had become two fundamentally different societies existing under a single flag. In the northern states, the Industrial Revolution had taken hold with unprecedented force. Factories dotted the landscape. Railroads carved through the countryside, connecting cities that grew taller and more crowded by the year. The northern economy was built on manufacturing, commerce, and wage labor. Progress, in the northern view, meant innovation and expansion, but the South followed a different path entirely. While the North industrialized, the South remained agrarian, its wealth concentrated in vast plantations where cotton reigned as king. The cultivation and export of cotton had made Southern planters extraordinarily wealthy. But this prosperity rested upon a dark foundation, the enslavement of approximately 4 million human beings who were bought, sold, and forced to labor without freedom or compensation. This was not merely a disagreement over economics or development. At its core, this was a moral reckoning that neither side could ignore. The North, influenced increasingly by abolitionist sentiment and progressive ideals about labor and human rights, viewed slavery as an institution that no civilized nation could sustain. The South, conversely, had built its entire social and economic order around slavery and saw any threat to the institution as an existential threat to its way of life. For decades, politicians had attempted to manage this escalating tension through a series of compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to maintain a balance between free and slave states as new territories were admitted to the Union. The Compromise of 1850 brought temporary relief through even more complex arrangements. Each compromise was seen as a temporary patch on a crack that was growing wider and deeper with each passing year. Each one provided a brief respite before the fundamental question returned with renewed urgency. Would America be a nation of free people or a nation built on slavery? The crux of the matter was simple but profound. Whoever controlled more states in Congress would control the nation's future direction. Would new territories entering the Union be admitted as free states or slave states? The answer to this question would determine not just the fate of those territories, but the trajectory of American democracy itself. In 1860, Americans faced a presidential election that would prove to be a turning point in their history. The man who would win that election was an unlikely choice by the standards of his time. Abraham Lincoln had not been born into privilege or wealth. He did not inherit a prestigious name or attend elite institutions. Instead, Lincoln emerged from poverty and hardship in a way that seemed almost impossible for someone who would later lead a nation. Lincoln's childhood in Kentucky was marked by deprivation. His family lived in a crude log cabin with a single room. His mother died when he was merely 9 years old, and his formal education amounted to less than a year in total. But what Lincoln lacked in formal schooling, he compensated for through an extraordinary capacity for self-education and determination. After working long days, splitting wood, and performing manual labor, Lincoln taught himself the law. He became a lawyer through sheer force of will and intellectual curiosity. Those who knew him recognized something fundamental in his character. He was a man of principle. He became known as Honest Abe, a reputation earned through small acts of integrity, such as the time he walked several miles to return 6 cents in change to a customer he had accidentally overcharged. This was the measure of the man. When Lincoln entered politics, his position on slavery was clear and unwavering. He opposed its expansion into new territories. He did not campaign on abolishing slavery where it already existed, but he was adamant that the institution should not be allowed to grow. To the Southern states, this was an unacceptable position. They saw Lincoln's election without a single electoral vote from the South as a clear sign that their political power was slipping away. South Carolina did not wait for Lincoln's inauguration before acting. In December 1860, even before the president-elect took office, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Within weeks, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These 7 states united to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln faced an immediate crisis. In Charleston Harbor, off the coast of South Carolina, stood Fort Sumter, a federal outpost that now found itself in Confederate territory. Both the Union and the Confederacy claimed jurisdiction over the fort. For Lincoln, the situation represented an impossible dilemma. If he sent reinforcements or supplies to support the Union garrison, the South would view it as an act of war. If he abandoned the fort, the North would perceive him as weak and defeatist. Lincoln's solution was an attempt at moderation. He would send only food to the soldiers inside the fort. No weapons, no military supplies, merely provisions to sustain the men. It was an act of desperate hope that the Confederacy might accept this humanitarian gesture. But Confederate leadership interpreted Lincoln's move differently. General P.G.T. Beauregard, commanding Confederate forces around Charleston Harbor, received orders to open fire on the fort. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery began a bombardment that would last for 34 consecutive hours. Remarkably, despite the ferocity of the attack, not a single soldier died in the initial shelling. But when the Union commander surrendered the fort, the symbolic impact resonated across the nation with devastating clarity. The war had begun. Lincoln responded swiftly by calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This action, however, had the opposite of its intended effect. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, immediately joined the Confederacy, believing that Lincoln had declared war upon them. The Union had grown smaller when it could least afford to do so. Virginia's secession was particularly significant. It was the crown jewel of Confederate states, and its departure brought with it the most consequential military figure the Confederacy would possess. Robert E. Lee was the son of a Revolutionary War general, a graduate of West Point Military Academy who had ranked second in his class, and a decorated officer in the Mexican-American War. Remarkably, when the Union desperately needed a commander, Lincoln had actually offered Lee the position of General-in-Chief of Union forces. Lee possessed deep reservations about secession and had publicly stated his opposition to slavery, calling it a moral and political evil. But when Virginia seceded, Lee faced an agonizing personal crisis. He could not reconcile fighting against his home state. Despite his doubts about secession, despite his moral opposition to slavery, Lee chose loyalty to Virginia. He joined the Confederate Army, bringing with him a military intellect that would confound Union generals for years to come. Both sides approached the conflict with a dangerous optimism. Military experts on both sides predicted that the war would be decided in a matter of months, perhaps even weeks. The mood among Northern civilians was almost festive. When Union troops marched toward Virginia, spectators from Washington, D.C. packed picnic baskets and rode out in carriages, treating the anticipated battle as a form of entertainment, a spectacle to witness before life returned to normal. The First Battle of Bull Run shattered these illusions. As Union forces advanced, they initially seemed to have the upper hand, pushing Confederate lines backward. But when Confederate Brigadier General Thomas Jackson arrived with his brigade, the momentum shifted. A Confederate officer, witnessing Jackson's steadfast defense, pointed and exclaimed that Jackson stood like a Stonewall. The nickname would remain with him for the rest of his life, Stonewall Jackson. Under Jackson's command, Confederate forces rallied, reorganized their counterattack, and drove Union forces into a chaotic retreat. The scene that followed was one of panic and confusion. Civilian spectators, who had expected a Union victory, found themselves caught in the midst of a military collapse. Union soldiers and civilian carriages tangled together in a desperate rush to escape. The spectators' celebration had transformed into chaos. The war, it became clear, would not be brief or limited in scope. As 1862 progressed, new military figures emerged who would define the conflict. In the Western Theater, General Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet man known for chain-smoking cigars, began a campaign that demonstrated a ruthlessness and determination that had been lacking in earlier Union efforts. Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. When the Confederate commander at Donelson inquired about surrender terms, Grant's response became legendary. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. Grant's defining test came at Shiloh, Tennessee, where Confederate forces surprised Union positions. For a moment, it appeared Union lines might collapse entirely. But Grant, who possessed a temperament that remained unshaken by adversity, reinforced his lines overnight and counterattacked at dawn. Victory came at a terrible price. Over 23,000 soldiers lay dead or wounded by day's end, a casualty figure that exceeded all combined American military casualties from previous conflicts. In the Eastern Theater, Lincoln appointed General George McClellan to lead the Army of the Potomac. McClellan possessed brilliance and strategic insight, but he was crippled by excessive caution. He convinced himself that enemy forces were always larger than they actually were, and refused to attack unless he possessed overwhelming numerical advantages and perfect conditions. Lincoln's frustration grew until he wrote to McClellan, "If you do not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, an ambitious attempt to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. Union troops advanced to within earshot of Richmond's church bells before Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee launched a ferocious counterattack. Lee's 7 days battles, while costly in Confederate casualties, succeeded in their objective. They pushed Union forces away from Richmond and shattered McClellan's confidence. McClellan retreated, convinced he had faced overwhelming numbers, when in fact Lee's army was actually smaller. Emboldened by his success, Lee made the bold decision to carry the war northward. He invaded Maryland, threatening Washington, D.C. and northern cities. The invasion seemed to presage Confederate victory, but fate intervened in an extraordinary way. A Union soldier discovered an abandoned Confederate camp and found a copy of Lee's battle plans, his complete strategic blueprint. Suddenly, McClellan held the Confederacy's operational secrets. For the first time, Union forces would face Lee's tactical genius while possessing foreknowledge of his intentions. The resulting engagement was the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862. It became the single bloodiest day in American military history. Union forces advanced through a cornfield where Confederate defenders unleashed devastating volley after volley. Bodies accumulated so thickly that later accounts described how a person could walk from one end of the field to the other without touching the ground. The battle moved to Bloody Lane, a sunken road where Confederate soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, creating a devastating killing zone. Union soldiers charged repeatedly, only to fall in waves. Eventually, Union troops flanked the road and fired downward into the trapped Confederate soldiers below, creating what amounted to a mass grave cut into the earth itself. The final engagement came at Antietam Creek, where Union forces crossed a bridge in an attempt to envelop the Confederate army. But Confederate reinforcements appeared at the critical moment, forcing the Union back. By nightfall, the cornfield had changed hands 15 times. Bloody Lane lay stacked 3 deep with bodies. When the smoke cleared and the carnage was tallied, over 23,000 soldiers lay dead, wounded or missing, the equivalent of the entire populations of small cities. While Antietam was technically a draw on the battlefield, it was a strategic victory for the Union. Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia, abandoning his invasion. More importantly, the Union victory allowed President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war from a struggle for the Union into a struggle for human freedom. Nearly 200,000 African American soldiers would eventually enlist in Union forces, while the Emancipation Proclamation also closed the door to European intervention on the Confederacy's behalf, as Britain and France could not openly defend slavery. In 1863, Lee attempted another invasion of the North, leading 75,000 soldiers into Pennsylvania. Lincoln desperately needed a general capable of stopping Lee. Just 3 days before battle, Lincoln replaced his commanding general with George Meade, a solid officer without brilliance but possessed of calm judgment and steadiness under pressure. The armies collided near the small town of Gettysburg. On the first day, Confederate forces gained the upper hand, but by day 2, the battle had evolved into a catastrophic struggle. Lee launched massive assaults against both Union flanks. One of the fiercest engagements came at Little Round Top, a rocky elevation that anchored the entire Union position. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry found himself outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Facing annihilation, Chamberlain made a desperate decision. He ordered a bayonet charge downhill. Against all odds, it worked. Elsewhere on the battlefield, hand-to-hand combat raged in darkness as Confederate forces stormed Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Union soldiers refused to break. Lee had hurled his forces against both flanks, and both had held. On day 3, Lee made a fateful decision. He would attack the Union center with a massive infantry assault, preceded by the heaviest artillery bombardment the Western Hemisphere had ever witnessed. For hours, cannon fire thundered across the landscape, and smoke so thick and black rose that it seemed to swallow the sun. Then came silence. Out of the haze emerged 12,000 Confederate soldiers in formation, marching deliberately across open ground toward Union positions. This was Pickett's charge, Lee's final gamble. Union artillery and rifles unleashed a hurricane of lead. Confederate soldiers fell by the hundreds and thousands, but the formation pressed forward. A few hundred Confederates actually broke through the Union line, led by General Lewis Armistead, who placed his hand upon a Union cannon and called for his men to seize it. But Armistead suddenly found himself alone. The charge had failed. Of 12,000 men who began that march, fewer than half returned without injury. When Lee rode out to meet his survivors, tears streamed down his weathered face. "It's all my fault," he said quietly to those around him. The Battle of Gettysburg resulted in approximately 50,000 total casualties and marked the turning point of the war. The Confederacy would never again invade Northern territory. While Gettysburg raged in the east, General Grant was executing a masterful campaign 900 miles away. He had spent months attempting to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. After numerous failed approaches, Grant devised an audacious plan. Under the cover of darkness, he sent Union gunboats directly past Vicksburg's cannons, accepting the risk that his entire plan could collapse if even one boat was struck. The darkness proved his salvation. Confederate gunners could not see the targets, and the Union boats glided past the fortifications unscathed. Grant tightened his stranglehold around Vicksburg. The Confederate garrison, surrounded and cut off from supply lines, found themselves in desperate straits. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. Soldiers slaughtered and consumed mules and dogs. In their final days, they hunted rats. By July 4, 1863, the Confederate commander surrendered. With victories at both Gettysburg and Vicksburg secured on the same day, the war had conclusively turned. The Confederacy, which had entered 1863 with possibilities of victory, ended it with no realistic chance of military triumph. Lincoln recognized what had changed. He had finally found his general. Lincoln promoted Grant to supreme command of all Union forces. Grant's strategy was designed to destroy the Confederacy's capacity to wage war. In the West, he ordered General William Tecumseh Sherman to destroy Confederate forces in Georgia and capture Atlanta. Sherman possessed a chilling military philosophy he termed total war. The idea that civilians' productive capacity must be destroyed to break their will to continue fighting. In the East, Grant himself would confront Lee in a series of devastating engagements across Virginia. The campaign began in the dense forests of the wilderness, where smoke hung so thick that soldiers could barely see in front of them. It continued at Spotsylvania, where bodies accumulated so rapidly that they had to be dragged away to continue fighting. At Cold Harbor, Grant's assault proved disastrous, costing over 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour, a decision Grant would later regret. Yet Grant possessed one crucial advantage: he could replace his losses. Every time Union ranks were depleted, replacements arrived from the north. Lee, fighting with diminishing resources, could not replenish his shrinking army. The mathematics of attrition favored the Union. By September, Sherman captured Atlanta, and Lincoln won re-election on a wave of military success. Sherman then proposed something radical. He would march to the Atlantic, destroying everything of military value along the way. With Grant's approval, Sherman set Atlanta ablaze and began his legendary march to the sea. 60,000 Union soldiers advanced in two massive columns, 60 miles wide. They destroyed railroads, burned factories, and liberated thousands of slaves who joined the march, singing of freedom. By the time Sherman reached Savannah, his army had carved a path of destruction nearly 300 miles long. Meanwhile, Lee's army in Virginia was collapsing. Desertion increased, ammunition dwindled, and soldiers starved. When Union forces broke through at Five Forks and severed Lee's last supply line, Petersburg fell, then Richmond. Lee fled westward with 30,000 desperate men, but Grant pursued relentlessly, cutting off every road and escape route. Surrounded, and with all hope exhausted, Lee requested a meeting with Grant. They met at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The contrast between the two generals was striking. Grant arrived in a mud-stained uniform, the appearance of a soldier who had not slept in days. Lee wore his finest dress uniform, with every button polished to gleaming brightness, a deliberate statement that whatever his defeat, he would maintain his dignity. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could retain their horses if they owned them. Officers could keep their sidearms. Every man would receive a parole and be allowed to return home. There would be no executions, no treason trials, no revenge. Lee's face softened with relief and emotion. "This will have a very happy effect on my army," he said quietly. Grant then asked if the starving Confederate soldiers needed supplies. Lee replied that 25,000 rations would be appreciated. Without hesitation, Grant arranged for 25,000 Union rations to be transferred to Lee's men. The two men shook hands, and Lee departed to inform his army of the surrender. As Lee rode back through his ranks, soldiers crowded around him, reaching for his hand, tears streaming down their faces. Lee, overwhelmed with emotion, could not speak. He removed his hat and saluted his men. The Civil War was over. The American Civil War had claimed over 600,000 lives, more than all other American wars combined until the conflict in Vietnam. From the ashes of this devastation, the United States was granted a second chance at its founding ideals. The war had ended slavery. The Union had been preserved. But there was one final tragedy. 5 days after Lee's surrender, as if fate could not resist adding a final cruel punctuation to the nation's suffering, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The tragedy lay not simply in the act itself, but in its timing. Lincoln had guided America through its darkest hour. He had preserved the Union when it seemed doomed to dissolution. He had struck the chains from 4 million enslaved people. He had sacrificed everything to bring the nation into a new era of freedom and unity. But he would not live to see that era fully realized. The man who saved America would not live to see it truly reborn. Yet in its conclusion, the American Civil War had accomplished what seemed impossible at its outset. It had transformed a nation that promised equality but practiced slavery into a nation committed, however imperfectly, to the actual fulfillment of those promises. At an almost inconceivable cost in human suffering, America had redefined itself and given a second chance to live up to its founding ideals.